The good news now is that we know exactly where those problems are, so that if we're going to have a solution, we know where to focus those efforts.
Why did the Pennsylvania DOT set up an advisory committee to look at the topic of truck parking? What was the mission there?
Sure. So PennDOT has a Transportation Advisory Committee that's a standing committee that's set up, and every year does about two or three topics that it studies, and it can be anything across the board from railway transportation to highway use to just about anything. And they take suggestions from their members and from outside the organization. And about a year and a half ago, they were soliciting topics to study last year. And truck parking was top of mind, obviously, for PMTA. So I wanted to propose a study about truck parking, but when I went to members, they said, "Oh, we've studied that issue to death. We do study after study on truck parking, and we know it's a problem. We know it's an issue. Just another study is not going to help anything. We know it's a problem." So I thought about that, and I thought, I don't want to lose this opportunity. So when I put together the proposal for the TAC, the Transportation Advisory Committee, I suggested that they updated their truck parking study that they had done a few years prior, but that they actually go a step further and two things, actually recommend some specific locations that would be most helpful to actually add some capacity for truck parking, but then also provide some very specific policy recommendations for how we actually solve the problem. So those were two things last year that this study was able to accomplish that I think went, a step farther than previous studies had.
Let's talk a little bit about the current state of truck parking in Pennsylvania. And obviously, there's been a lot of study of that particular topic. How are things right now in the state?
Well, it's a little tough. We know that Pennsylvania is one of 5 states that truckers named as being one of the hardest to find places to stop for the night. We also know from the most current study that was done last year that Pennsylvania is about 3% over capacity in its truck parking spots at peak hours of the night. So we know it's a problem here. And it's short about 1,000 spaces during its peak hours. So we know it's an issue. As you're driving on the roads in Pennsylvania, you can see trucks parked along the sides of the roads and on the on and off ramps, which we know is an issue. And the good news, if you can say there's good news about this, the good news now is that we know exactly where those problems are, so that if we're going to have a solution, we know where to focus those efforts.
I want to go back to that 2007 study for just a little bit here. And I'm wondering if you can go into a little bit more detail in terms of what the conclusions of that study was. What did the study find?
Well, I don't have the 2000 study in front of me. I have the one that was updated in 2020, which, as we know, was a little different because it was during COVID. So we know things were, a little bit stretched during that period. Actually, what I have is what I have in front of me, I guess, is the 2023 study. So the 2022 was updated, and then they updated again in 2023. In 2020, though, that capacity was actually at 105% during the peak hours, and that reduced slightly when they did the study last year in 2023 to 103%. So we know it came down a little bit, but it was still over 100% during that time period. In 2023, there were 290 parking facilities in Pennsylvania for a total of 12,010 spaces. And like I said, that was at 103% utilization during the peak hours. So there were 980 trucks parked on ramps and shoulders when they did the survey last year. So clearly a problem. And that had increased since the 2007 study. I didn't go back and check that again, but definitely was becoming more of a problem over time.
The study says that the DOT developed what they called a criteria-based approach to determine the need for truck parking. Can you kind of tell us what some of the criteria were?
Yes. they did use some 10 priority, they identified 10 priority corridors in Pennsylvania that were what they call tier 1. So there's a map that's posted in the study of tier 1 corridors. And the factors that they put into that sort of prioritization were being part of the national highway system, obviously the national freight highway network. But they looked at some very specific truck, specific criteria, including truck volumes, truck parking capacity, proximity to freight hubs, freight related employment, which was an interesting one I thought to include in there. Shoulder and ramp parking problems, which obviously were, surveyed last year, truck crash rates, bottlenecks, truck bottlenecks, and also road closures. So those were the criteria that went into assessing the tiers.
You mentioned the 10 priority corridors, and I'm assuming those are the places where the need is the greatest, self-evident. But I'm wondering if you can give us a couple of examples of where the greatest need is, some actual, which actual corridors are we talking about?
Yeah, I do have those here. There were 3 on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. I remember that. And the other ones are the major freight corridors in Pennsylvania that, everyone kind of knows. I-76 from US 1 to I-95 in Philadelphia, which is right around a couple of truck bottlenecks that I'm sure your listeners are aware of right in that area. The 3 bottlenecks that we have in the top 100 in Pennsylvania are right in that vicinity there. I-78, which is also exit 49, that area is a huge emerging warehouse and distribution area of Pennsylvania. So that also is on the list. I-79 out near the Pennsylvania Turnpike around Pittsburgh there. I-81 around the Carlisle area. Out where I am here near the Susquehanna River, that's I-81 is a big freight corridor, obviously, again, warehousing distribution in this area, and actually all the way up to 78, where we have sort of a linkage between 2 major warehousing hubs here, and I-83, pretty much most of the length of I-83. That's pretty much it. The Philadelphia area and those 3 areas on the Turnpike in Philadelphia, and then the I-176 near Norristown. So those are the 10 areas right there. And I don't think any of them are a surprise to any of your listeners, is my guess.
Probably not. One of the things the Transportation Advisory Committee did was make some recommendations to DOT about removing barriers. And this is really a problem in every state. But I'm wondering, in Pennsylvania particularly, what were some of the recommendations? What are the barriers that they see, and how do they think that those should be overcome?
Yeah, like I said, one thing I'm really happy about this study is that they actually do have a number of specific recommendations where I don't think we were able to really get to that point before. We were able to document the fact that this was a major problem, but I don't know that we really got to the point where we were talking about specific solutions. So I am really happy that we are at that point now where we have specific solutions. But like you said, there are barriers involved, and they did identify a number of barriers, and they have specific recommendations to overcome those barriers. So one of the barriers is, and as you can guess from where some of those priority corridors are, one of them is the cost of real estate. So when we're talking about Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, which is where some of those highest priority corridors are, the cost of real estate is high in those areas. There's no doubt about it. It's at a premium. There's not a lot of real estate available. So that was one of the barriers. And sort of related to that, the availability of appropriate sites. So where there's not a lot of sites available, or they're not zoned appropriately, then the cost is going to be high. So that was another barrier that was identified by stakeholders. Then we get into sort of quality of life concerns, community concerns, where you might have, local residents who push back against getting additional truck traffic in their area. And there were some recommendations about communicating the importance of trucks, and Also communicating that there are ways to manage those conflicts, and there are best practices for putting truck parking, facilities in place that don't conflict with communities. So that was identified, and some recommendations there. Municipal and regulatory issues were discussed as well. How do we get around and how do we facilitate working with municipalities and get beyond sort of the regulatory issues involved there? And then going into some of the state and federal policies that would need to be discussed as well. How do we promote truck parking amongst adjoining states? Because we know that it's not just a Pennsylvania problem. In order to solve some of the issues on I-78, for example, I think probably you need to have some conversations with New Jersey. Those were some of the barriers that were identified, and the 19 recommendations that were provided all sort of fall into the buckets of solving or addressing some of those barriers.
There's a whole thing here in terms of private parking and publicly provided parking. And one of the things that the study apparently looked into was public-private partnerships. Did the committee give some examples of what that might look like?
Yeah, it's really interesting. One of the recommendations, one of the types of P3s that they discussed was perhaps doing sort of a reverse P3, where a developer may have a tract of property that they have available, but may not have the funding in order to develop it. There's the potential that they may be able to sort of lease that property to the state, to a state agency, and then would be able to do a P3 or access some P3 funding that would permit them to develop that for truck parking. So that would be sort of an innovative P3 solution that wouldn't otherwise be available to that developer. So that was an interesting solution that came out of these discussions. Of course, there's your more traditional P3s that would be available too, where the state would work with a developer, in sort of a more traditional sense. But I thought that was a really innovative solution that I hadn't heard discussed before. So I know the task force that's working right now is looking into where it might be appropriate to use a P3 solution like that.
What about publicly owned and operated parking? How does that fit into the situation overall in terms of the study's recommendations?
Yeah, I think in two ways. One is the study recommends looking at surplus property around the state, both with PennDOT and with the other state agencies. And I know we haven't gotten very far down that road yet, but PennDOT is starting to analyze the surplus property that it may have as a part of the right-of-ways that it owns around the state. And the next step would be to sort of look at some other agencies that own property around the state too. So that's one way in which we can take a look at that.
Well, now that the study's complete, what in your mind is the next step?
Well, the next step, it's really exciting actually, because we're just getting started, because the task force is up and running with PennDOT, and so we've only really begun getting through the sort of the checklist of things that we're working on. So there is one of the recommendations was to create an executive sponsor at PennDOT and an implementation task force. So those two things have been accomplished, and that task force is working right now. So we've already started to talk about potential locations for truck parking where it might be appropriate to start to talk about federal grant opportunities. So we've already talked about that. Like I said, we're already talking about potential locations on PennDOT and other properties. We're working with the legislature to identify whether there might be any tools that we could use to incentivize truck parking. That will be a great opportunity as well, and perhaps even for private industries and private developers. PennDOT, and this is the other thing I was trying to think of with regard to state properties. PennDOT is working with its district planners to try to identify what other opportunities there may be out in the districts on PennDOT properties. So that's the other state, opportunity that we may have. So they're working on that as well. We're starting to reach out to metropolitan and rural planning organizations too, because we know a lot of this work is going to have to be done out in the regions around Pennsylvania and in local planning authorities. So we're reaching out there too to make sure they understand the issue and understand what tools they have to work with local developers and local planners and municipalities to really dig in and start addressing truck parking. We're even going as far as to share some model ordinances and things for localities.
Solutions to just about anything, but certainly when we talk about truck parking, really requires two things above all, which is time and money. Um, how much time do you think it will take to make a serious impact on the situation? I mean, this stuff doesn't happen overnight, obviously, but do you have an idea of a timeline?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, like you said, we're not going to solve the issue overnight for sure, but this is something that I see is going to be a piecemeal approach. To the extent that we can get the word out that this is an issue, and we start, private industry, shippers and receivers, as well as local planning and municipal officials to think about this issue, and all of them to start to really plan to add capacity, whether it's a large parking facility with 100 spaces, or adding a few parking spaces at a local warehousing facility or shared facility between several shippers and receivers. Every space counts, and if we can get everybody thinking about where they can add some extra truck parking spaces across the entire state, eventually that's all going to add up to some major capacity. So I think right away, if we can start people thinking about this and start adding across the state, it's going to add up pretty quick. So I don't see any reason why right away we can't start adding some capacity here.
The other half of that, of course, is the cost equation. You mentioned uh, looking for incoming money, like federal grants, and certainly, of course, the state budget could be involved. But do you have any kind of idea of the cost of making a significant impact on the problem?
No, that's a great question too. So obviously it's going to depend on the type of parking facility. Everything's going to be a little bit different. We're hoping as we educate shippers and receivers and warehousing, businesses, that adding some parking capacity to facilities that they already have, and sort of developing facilities that they have is not a high cost, hopefully, to a lot of those types of facilities. Building a large truck parking facility is an expensive endeavor. So it's everything from, not a lot to a whole lot. So it's going to run the gambit. From the standpoint of funding, I think we're hoping that Truck Parking Safety Improvement Act in Congress makes some headway, because that will be an infusion of funding, a long overdue infusion of funding, that we hope makes it across the finish line. Because I am very happy that we have this study completed, because it's really going to set the groundwork here in Pennsylvania. As soon as we have some funding, some additional funding available, because I know there's already some discretionary funds available. As soon as we have some additional funding available, we are set to go to put an application together, because we already have done our homework. We already have the information and the research done, that we'll be able to put an application into to be ready to respond to that funding. So we're happy about that. And like I said, we're also looking at what types of incentives we may be able to provide at the state level as well. So we're really happy that we have, like I said, we've done the homework to try to be able to pounce on some funding opportunities as soon as we have them available.
I want to talk about one last thing, and this is something you kind of referred to earlier when you talked about local residents and lifestyle issues and that, but the classic NIMBY problem, the people that say not in my backyard. Did the study really, or the committee, look at ways to deal with that? It seemed like you were mentioning earlier that they did have some idea of working with that problem, but what did they suggest?
Yeah, so the Federal Highway Administration put out a great handbook last year on truck parking that really included a lot of best practices. So for including how to build a truck parking facility that doesn't have conflicts with surrounding neighborhoods, and even things like lighting and barriers and things like that, traffic flow. I'm really happy that our report here actually recommended a Pennsylvania truck parking handbook that would include a lot of those same recommendations that a local township, for example, could use when working with a developer to try to put some of those things into place. And I also am happy that the report includes communication and education about to residents. So all of us need to work together to educate residents about how important it is to protect, safety for drivers and for other for all of us out on the road, to make sure truckers have safe places to stop. So it's an education that we all need to educate folks about that, and then having that truck parking handbook available in order to further educate and provide that out to around the state, I think is going to be really helpful.
That's all I have, Rebecca. Is there anything else that you want to add?
No, I mean, I'll just say, I think it's so important. We all know that highways are our truck drivers' workplaces. They deserve and they need safe places to rest and stop. So we really believe that investing in truck parking facilities is so critical to the men and women who are out there every day. We thank them all for keeping our supply chain running. So we really believed it was important to make our roads safer and make sure that we got this study done, that we can try to make some headway. And I'm really excited about where we're going to move from here.